Night settles gently over Harlem, the kind of night where the city does not sleep but instead exhales. Streetlights hum with a low electrical buzz, casting long amber reflections across wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a train rattles along steel tracks, steady and unhurried, like a heartbeat that has learned patience. This is a neighborhood that has seen music rise and fade, movements ignite and disappear, empires bloom and collapse without ceremony. And moving quietly through these streets, almost unnoticed for many years, was a man whose power did not announce itself with gunfire or spectacle. His name was Frank Lucas, and he ruled Harlem not with noise, but with silence. In the world of organized crime, history tends to favor the loud. The flamboyant dawns, the public trials, the dramatic downfalls splashed across newspapers and television screens. Yet beneath those stories lies another kind of power, colder and more enduring. Frank Lucas belonged to that second category. He was not a man who sought attention, nor one who needed approval. He dressed plainly for most of his rise, spoke softly, and listened far more than he talked. While others demanded respect through fear, Frank Lucas allowed people to underestimate him. And in that underestimation, he built one of the most profitable heroin empires America had ever seen. To understand Frank Lucas, it helps to slow down, to let the story unfold at the same deliberate pace he lived by. This is not a tale of sudden explosions or reckless bravado. It is a story shaped by patience, observation, and a deep understanding of how power truly moves. Like the quiet current beneath a river's surface, his influence flowed unseen, shaping everything above it. Harlem in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a place of contrasts. By day, children played on stoops, vendors sold food from carts, and music drifted from open windows. By night, shadows stretched longer, and the economy shifted into something more dangerous, more profitable, and more desperate. Drugs were not just substances, they were currency, control, and escape. Entire blocks lived and died by the invisible rules of supply and demand. Most people saw chaos. Frank Lucas saw opportunity. What made him different was not cruelty, though cruelty existed in his world. It was not intelligence alone, though he was undeniably sharp. It was discipline. Frank believed that attention was the enemy of longevity. While others flaunted their wealth with flashy cars and loud clubs, he studied logistics. While rivals argued over territory, he examined supply chains. He approached crime the way a businessman approaches inventory, cost reduction, and distribution. Calmly. Quietly. Relentlessly. People often ask how someone like Frank Lucas could operate for so long without becoming a household name. The answer lies in how he understood human nature. Law enforcement chased stereotypes. They looked for Italian mob bosses, flashy dealers, violent enforcers. Frank Lucas did not fit the picture. He appeared almost ordinary, blending into crowds, speaking respectfully, avoiding unnecessary confrontation. In a world obsessed with noise, he mastered invisibility. As this story unfolds, it will move through places and moments that shaped him. From the red clay roads of the American South to the crowded streets of New York City. From whispered conversations in back rooms to international routes stretching across oceans and war zones. But at its core, this is not just the story of a drug dealer. It is the story of how trauma, ambition, and restraint can combine to create something both powerful and deeply destructive. There is a temptation, especially in stories like this, to glorify the rise. To admire the cleverness, the defiance, the ability to outmaneuver larger systems. This story resists that temptation. Instead, it invites quiet reflection. For every dollar earned, there were lives lost. For every smart decision, there was a consequence waiting patiently in the background. Power, in the end, always demands payment. Frank Lucas himself once said that the loudest man in the room is usually the weakest. He lived by that belief, and it carried him further than anyone expected. But silence has its limits. No matter how carefully one moves through shadows, the light eventually shifts. And when it does, even the quietest king can no longer hide. As you listen, allow the pace to remain slow and steady. This is a story meant to be absorbed, not rushed. Like walking through Harlem late at night, where every block holds echoes of the past. Where footsteps once carried ambition, fear, hope, and regret in equal measure. Frank Lucas walked these streets with purpose, believing he could control the game without becoming part of the spectacle. For a long time, he was right. What follows is the journey of a man shaped by violence he did not choose, who sought control in a world that offered none. A man who learned early that survival favored the quiet observer over the reckless talker. A man who built an empire not on noise, but on precision. And as with all empires, no matter how quietly they rise, they eventually face the same question in the darkness: how long can silence protect you? Tonight, as the city hums softly and the streets grow still, that question lingers. And the story of Frank Lucas begins, not with a gunshot or a headline, but with a calm presence moving through Harlem's shadows, unseen, calculating, and patient. Long before Harlem's brick buildings and glowing streetlights became part of Frank Lucas's world, there was another landscape that shaped him far more deeply. It was quieter, harsher, and marked by a kind of fear that settled into the bones. Rural North Carolina in the 1930s and 1940s was a place where the land stretched wide but opportunity did not. Fields rolled outward under an unforgiving sun, and the rhythm of life was dictated by labor, poverty, and rules that were never written down but always enforced. Frank Lucas was born into this world, a child of the segregated South, where survival depended not on ambition but on obedience. For black families, even the smallest misstep could carry deadly consequences. The air itself felt watchful. Adults spoke in lowered voices, children learned early when to stay quiet, and everyone understood which roads were safe and which were not. This environment did not encourage dreams. It taught restraint. Frank's family lived simply. There was little money, little comfort, and even less protection from the forces that governed daily life. Work began early and ended late. The fields did not care who you were or how tired you felt. Hunger was familiar, and so was exhaustion. But more than physical hardship, it was the constant presence of racial violence that left the deepest mark. The rules of the world were clear, and they were enforced without mercy. One moment in particular would follow Frank Lucas for the rest of his life. As a young boy, he witnessed an act of violence so brutal that it shattered any illusion of safety. A black man in his community was murdered by white men for what amounted to a minor, perceived offense. There was no trial, no justice, and no protection. The killing was public, deliberate, and meant to send a message. Frank watched, powerless, as life was taken without consequence. That moment did not turn him reckless. It did something far more subtle. It taught him that power did not belong to those who were right, but to those who were untouchable. It taught him that survival required awareness, patience, and the ability to read danger before it announced itself. Frank learned to observe people closely, to notice shifts in tone, posture, and silence. He learned when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. In the South, silence was not weakness. It was armor. Frank carried that lesson with him as he grew older. While other boys dreamed of escape in loud, obvious ways, Frank absorbed his surroundings quietly. He watched how authority behaved, how fear controlled communities, and how systems protected some while destroying others. These observations did not make him angry in an explosive way. They made him coldly aware. Home offered little refuge. Like many families trapped in poverty, stress hung heavy in the air. Opportunities were scarce, and expectations were limited. Education existed, but advancement was more theory than reality. For black children, the future was narrow and clearly defined by invisible boundaries. Frank understood early that staying meant submission. Leaving meant risk. And risk, while dangerous, also held possibility. As he entered adolescence, the weight of these realizations pressed harder. The South was not changing fast enough, and patience offered no reward. Stories drifted down from the North, of cities where black men walked with a different kind of confidence, where money could be made, and where the rules, while still unfair, were less openly lethal. New York City became more than a place on a map. It became an idea. A promise. A distant hum of opportunity calling from far beyond the fields. The decision to leave was not dramatic. There was no farewell speech or emotional departure. It was practical. Necessary. Frank understood that to survive, he had to place distance between himself and the land that had taught him fear. The South had shown him what happened to those without power. He intended never to be powerless again. When Frank Lucas boarded a bus north, he carried little with him. No wealth. No connections. Only lessons learned in silence. He had seen what violence looked like when it was uncontrolled and unjust. He had learned that visibility could be fatal. These ideas settled deep within him, shaping how he would move through every space he entered from that point forward. The journey itself felt symbolic. As the bus rolled through miles of darkness, leaving behind dirt roads and cotton fields, Frank looked forward into uncertainty. The North was not guaranteed safety, but it offered anonymity. In anonymity, there was room to grow. To observe. To learn new systems of power. He did not yet know what role he would play in that world, only that he would not allow himself to be crushed by it. What Frank did not leave behind was memory. The image of that murdered man stayed with him, a constant reminder of what happens when others control your fate. It hardened him, not into a violent person, but into a calculating one. He did not seek revenge on the past. He sought insulation from it. Power, he believed, was protection. And protection required control. As Harlem would later learn, Frank Lucas's ambition was not fueled by greed alone. It was fueled by fear, shaped into discipline. By a childhood spent watching injustice unfold without consequence. By a world that taught him the cost of being seen without being respected. The South had given him a harsh education, one no school could provide. When he finally stepped off the bus in New York, the noise must have felt overwhelming. But beneath that noise, Frank carried the quiet focus of someone who had survived worse. He was not impressed by chaos. He had grown up under it. What interested him was structure. Order. Systems that could be bent, studied, and eventually mastered. This chapter of his life did not make him a criminal. It made him cautious. It made him patient. And above all, it made him determined never to stand helpless again while others decided his worth. The boy from North Carolina had learned how the world worked when it was at its most cruel. And in that understanding, the foundation of the quiet king was already forming, long before Harlem ever knew his name. When Frank Lucas arrived in New York City, the noise came first. It rolled through the streets like a living thing, car horns, voices overlapping, music leaking from open windows, footsteps echoing on concrete. After the quiet tension of rural North Carolina, the city felt almost unreal, as if it never paused to breathe. Harlem, in particular, pulsed with its own rhythm. It was crowded, energetic, and alive with possibility, yet underneath that energy ran a current of danger that Frank sensed immediately. Harlem was not the glamorous dream many imagined from a distance. It was a place shaped by resilience and struggle, beauty and decay existing side by side. Brownstones stood shoulder to shoulder, some well-kept, others crumbling under years of neglect. The streets carried history in their cracks, jazz clubs that once hosted legends, storefront churches filled with hope, and alleyways where deals were made quietly and consequences were never written down. For Frank Lucas, Harlem was both intimidating and inviting. It was a place where a man could disappear, but also a place where a man could become something else entirely. Like many newcomers, Frank arrived with little more than determination. There were no grand welcomes, no guiding hands waiting to lift him upward. He took whatever work he could find, learning quickly that survival in the city required adaptability. Jobs came and went, pay was unreliable, and dignity was often traded for rent money. But Frank was not discouraged. He had not come north expecting comfort. He had come looking for space to maneuver, to observe, to choose his path. What set Frank apart in those early days was how carefully he watched the city. While others rushed headlong into opportunities, he moved slowly, learning the unspoken rules. He noticed which corners belonged to whom, which faces commanded respect, and which conversations ended abruptly when certain people appeared. Harlem was governed not just by law, but by layers of authority operating quietly beneath the surface. Frank recognized this immediately. It reminded him of the South, where power also existed beyond official structures. The street economy revealed itself gradually. Numbers running, gambling, prostitution, and drug dealing were woven into daily life, not hidden but not openly discussed either. Everyone seemed to know someone involved, yet few spoke about it directly. Frank observed how money flowed, how disputes were settled, and how reputation mattered more than words. He learned that the loudest men often drew the most trouble, while those who kept their heads down lasted longer. At first, Frank existed on the edges of this world. He was cautious, unwilling to draw attention to himself. The memory of the South, of what visibility could cost, stayed with him. Harlem offered more freedom, but it did not erase danger. Violence still existed, though it wore a different face. Here, it came from competition, betrayal, and ambition unchecked. Frank understood that entering this world without preparation would be foolish. As weeks turned into months, he began to form connections, not friendships, but associations. He listened more than he spoke, offering respect where it was due and avoiding unnecessary conflict. This earned him a reputation as someone reliable, someone who did not cause problems. In a place where trouble often followed impulsive behavior, Frank's restraint stood out. One of the most important realizations Frank had during this period was that Harlem operated like a living system. Everyone had a role, from street-level runners to those who never touched the product but controlled its movement. The system rewarded loyalty, discretion, and patience. It punished recklessness. Frank saw in this structure a reflection of his own instincts. He did not crave the chaos of street-level hustle. He was drawn to the order behind it. He also saw the influence of organized crime, particularly the Italian mafia, which held significant control over the city's underworld. Their presence was not always visible, but it was deeply felt. They controlled supply lines, enforced rules, and decided who could operate and who could not. For a young black man from the South, this hierarchy presented both a barrier and a lesson. Frank paid close attention to how power was centralized and protected. During this time, Frank supported himself through small-time hustles and menial jobs. These experiences were not glamorous, but they were educational. He learned how desperation pushed people into bad decisions. He learned how money could change behavior instantly. And he learned that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. These lessons settled quietly, shaping his understanding of human nature. Harlem also exposed Frank to ambition on a scale he had never seen before. Men talked about owning buildings, controlling blocks, influencing neighborhoods. The idea that power could be accumulated, not just survived, fascinated him. But unlike many who chased that power recklessly, Frank believed in preparation. He did not rush toward the center. He studied the edges first. As night fell over Harlem, Frank often walked the streets, absorbing the atmosphere. Neon signs flickered, casting soft colors onto sidewalks slick with rain. Music drifted from clubs, blending laughter with sorrow. There was a sense that anything could happen here, at any hour. For Frank, these walks were not aimless. They were lessons. He was learning the city's language, its moods, its warnings. Slowly, he began to understand that Harlem was not just a destination, it was a proving ground. It tested people, stripping away illusions and rewarding those who adapted. Frank adapted by remaining invisible. He did not boast, did not threaten, did not overreach. He waited. The city, in return, began to reveal opportunities. Small chances to prove reliability. Moments to demonstrate discretion. Frank took these chances carefully, never more than he could handle. Each step forward was measured, intentional. He was building something, though even he may not have fully understood what it would become. This period of his life was defined by transition. He was no longer the boy from North Carolina, shaped solely by fear and limitation. But he was not yet the man who would command respect in Harlem's shadows. He existed in between, absorbing the city's lessons, letting them refine him. What Harlem gave Frank Lucas was not immediate success, but clarity. It showed him that power did not have to be loud. That control could be exercised through systems rather than force. That patience, when combined with insight, could outlast aggression. These realizations settled deep within him, aligning perfectly with the instincts formed in his childhood. As Frank moved deeper into Harlem's rhythm, one truth became clear: this city did not reward dreams alone. It rewarded understanding. And Frank Lucas was learning to understand it better than most. The quiet observer was preparing for his next step, even if the city itself had not yet noticed him. In Harlem, power did not always sit in the open. Sometimes it occupied a small table in the corner of a restaurant, or a quiet office above a storefront, where conversations happened in low voices and decisions carried more weight than gunfire. It was in these quiet spaces that Frank Lucas first encountered the presence of Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson, a man whose reputation loomed far larger than his physical movements ever suggested. Bumpy was not just a gangster. He was an institution, a figure woven into the very fabric of Harlem's underworld. By the time Frank became aware of him, Bumpy Johnson had already lived several lifetimes. He was respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. Unlike the loud criminals who chased attention, Bumpy commanded loyalty through intelligence and restraint. He dressed sharply but not extravagantly, spoke with precision, and carried himself with a calm authority that left no doubt about where he stood. To many in Harlem, he was not merely a criminal figure, but a protector of sorts, someone who kept outside forces in check. Frank did not approach Bumpy directly. That would have been unthinkable. Instead, he remained on the periphery, observing from a distance, learning through others. He listened to stories told in half-sentences and careful pauses. He noticed how conversations shifted when Bumpy's name was mentioned, how arguments ended rather than escalated. Respect followed Bumpy like a shadow, silent but unmistakable. Over time, Frank's reliability began to earn him small responsibilities within the circles that touched Bumpy's world. These were not glamorous tasks. They required punctuality, discretion, and an ability to follow instructions without question. Frank excelled at all three. He understood that trust was built not through words, but through consistency. In a world where betrayal was common, someone who could be counted on was invaluable. When Frank finally came into closer contact with Bumpy Johnson, it was not marked by ceremony. There was no dramatic introduction, no declaration of mentorship. It was subtle, almost understated. Bumpy noticed Frank because Frank did not try to be noticed. He worked quietly, carried himself with respect, and never overstepped his place. These qualities resonated deeply with Bumpy, who valued discipline above bravado. Bumpy Johnson saw in Frank something rare, a young man who understood that survival depended on patience. Bumpy had learned this lesson the hard way, through years of imprisonment, negotiation with the Italian mafia, and constant balancing of power. Harlem under Bumpy was not free of crime, but it was stable. Violence was controlled. Chaos was bad for business, and Bumpy understood business better than most. Under Bumpy's informal guidance, Frank began to see the larger picture of organized crime. It was not about street fights or emotional decisions. It was about relationships, supply chains, and leverage. Bumpy spoke little, but when he did, Frank listened carefully. Lessons were delivered indirectly, through example rather than instruction. How Bumpy handled disputes. How he treated allies. How he dealt with enemies, often by avoiding confrontation entirely. One of the most important lessons Frank absorbed was the value of dignity. Bumpy believed that respect was not demanded, but earned and maintained through behavior. He paid his debts, protected his people, and never allowed emotions to dictate decisions. This approach left a lasting impression on Frank. It reinforced his belief that true power was quiet, composed, and calculated. Bumpy also demonstrated the importance of understanding one's place within a larger system. Harlem's underworld did not exist in isolation. It was entangled with political figures, law enforcement, and the Italian mafia families who controlled much of New York's criminal infrastructure. Bumpy navigated these relationships carefully, maintaining a delicate balance that kept Harlem relatively autonomous. Frank watched closely, learning how negotiation could be more powerful than force. During this period, Frank's role expanded gradually. He was entrusted with more responsibility, more access, more insight. Each step forward was earned, never given. Bumpy tested him without making it obvious, placing him in situations that required judgment and restraint. Frank passed these tests by remaining calm and loyal, never acting impulsively. The relationship between Bumpy and Frank was not sentimental. There were no emotional speeches or declarations of loyalty. It was built on mutual understanding. Bumpy recognized Frank's potential, and Frank respected Bumpy's authority. This mutual respect formed the foundation of their connection. Harlem during this era felt strangely balanced. There was crime, but it was managed. There was danger, but it was predictable. Under Bumpy's influence, the neighborhood maintained a certain order. Frank observed how this stability allowed businesses to function, families to survive, and money to flow. He began to understand that the absence of chaos was itself a form of control. As years passed, Frank became increasingly aware of the fragility of this balance. Bumpy was aging, and his long history of incarceration and conflict had taken its toll. Rumors of declining health circulated quietly. Nothing was said openly, but everyone sensed that change was coming. For Frank, this realization planted the first seeds of something larger. He did not see Bumpy's eventual absence as an opportunity to seize power violently. Instead, he began thinking about continuity. About how systems could survive beyond individuals. About how control could be maintained without drawing attention. These thoughts aligned naturally with his own instincts. Bumpy Johnson's influence on Frank Lucas cannot be overstated. He did not teach him how to be ruthless. He taught him how to be disciplined. He did not encourage excess. He demonstrated restraint. He showed Frank that power, when exercised wisely, did not need to announce itself. When Bumpy eventually passed away, Harlem felt the loss deeply. The streets did not erupt into chaos, but the absence was palpable. A quiet certainty had vanished. For Frank, the loss was personal as well as strategic. He had lost a mentor, but also a stabilizing force. What remained was a vacuum, subtle but undeniable. Frank Lucas stood at the edge of that vacuum, shaped by years of observation and guided by lessons learned in silence. He did not rush forward. He did what he had always done. He watched. He waited. And in that waiting, the foundations of his own quiet rise were already firmly in place. When Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson died, Harlem did not erupt in open conflict. There were no immediate turf wars, no loud declarations of succession. Instead, a hush settled over the neighborhood, the kind of silence that follows the removal of a stabilizing force. People went about their routines, but beneath the surface, uncertainty spread. Power, once clearly defined, now felt fluid. And in that uncertainty, every careful observer understood that something was changing. For years, Bumpy had acted as a quiet anchor. His presence discouraged recklessness, his reputation prevented unnecessary challenges. With him gone, the balance he maintained began to loosen. Those who had relied on his authority felt exposed. Those who had resented it began to consider their options. Harlem's underworld entered a period of transition, one defined less by violence and more by hesitation. Frank Lucas felt this shift immediately. He had spent years learning under Bumpy's shadow, absorbing lessons in patience and restraint. Now, that shadow was gone. The man who had provided structure and protection was no longer there to absorb pressure from outside forces. Italian mafia families, long tolerant of Bumpy's autonomy, quietly reassessed Harlem's status. Smaller operators wondered who would step forward, and on what terms. Frank did not rush to fill the void. That would have gone against everything he had learned. Instead, he watched how others reacted. Some became louder, more aggressive, trying to claim territory through visibility. Frank recognized this as a mistake. Attention invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited consequences. The vacuum left by Bumpy's death was not meant to be filled quickly. It needed to be understood. In the weeks following the funeral, Frank maintained his routines. He showed respect where it was due, avoided unnecessary disputes, and kept his movements predictable. This consistency reassured those around him. While others seemed restless, Frank appeared calm. That calm, in itself, became a signal. People began to see him not as a challenger, but as a constant. What Frank understood, perhaps better than anyone else, was that power did not need to be claimed publicly. It could be assumed quietly, through competence and reliability. People gravitated toward stability, especially in uncertain times. Frank provided that without ever announcing his intentions. Behind the scenes, however, he was thinking carefully about the future. Bumpy's death had exposed a critical weakness in Harlem's criminal structure: dependence on outside suppliers. The Italian mafia still controlled much of the heroin flow into the city. Black operators were allowed to distribute, but only at the pleasure of those above them. Bumpy had managed this relationship through negotiation and personal authority. Without him, Harlem's position was vulnerable. Frank saw this not as a temporary problem, but as a fundamental limitation. As long as supply was controlled by others, true independence was impossible. This realization marked a turning point. For the first time, Frank began to think beyond survival and stability. He began to think about control. He did not share these thoughts openly. Doing so would have been dangerous. Instead, he began gathering information quietly. He listened to conversations about pricing, shortages, and disputes. He noted how dependent local dealers were on middlemen. Each complaint, each delay, reinforced his growing belief that the system itself needed to change. At the same time, Frank paid close attention to law enforcement patterns. The absence of Bumpy had not gone unnoticed by authorities. Increased surveillance, subtle at first, hinted that Harlem was once again under scrutiny. Frank understood that any move made during this period would be watched closely. Timing would be everything. While others sought to assert dominance through visible means, Frank focused on relationships. He strengthened ties with those he trusted, people who valued discretion over drama. He avoided alliances that demanded loyalty through fear. Instead, he built networks based on mutual benefit and reliability. These networks were quiet, flexible, and resilient. Frank also began to reassess his own role. Under Bumpy, he had been a trusted lieutenant, protected by a larger presence. Now, protection would have to come from strategy rather than association. He recognized that the era of relying on another man's authority was over. If he wanted security, he would have to create it himself. This period was marked by restraint. Frank resisted the temptation to expand too quickly. He knew that growth without control led to exposure. Every step forward was calculated, every decision weighed against potential consequences. In this, he differed sharply from others who mistook opportunity for urgency. Harlem's streets, once stabilized by Bumpy's quiet rule, felt subtly different now. Conversations were edged with uncertainty. Deals were approached with caution. Trust was harder to come by. Frank moved through this environment with practiced calm, offering continuity in a time of flux. As months passed, it became clear that no single figure would replace Bumpy outright. Instead, influence would be distributed among those capable of maintaining order. Frank became one of those figures, though few would have described him as such. He did not demand recognition. He allowed others to arrive at their own conclusions. Inside, however, his ambitions were sharpening. The limitations of the existing system frustrated him. He had seen how dependence bred vulnerability, how middlemen siphoned profit and imposed control. He believed there was a better way, a more efficient structure that eliminated unnecessary layers. This belief did not arise from arrogance. It came from observation. From years of watching how systems failed. Frank understood that innovation, even in the criminal world, carried risk. But he also understood that stagnation carried its own dangers. Without adaptation, Harlem's operators would always remain subordinate. The vacuum left by Bumpy's death was not a void of chaos. It was a space of possibility. Frank recognized this and approached it with caution and foresight. He did not seek to be crowned. He sought to be indispensable. By the end of this transitional period, Frank Lucas had not declared himself anything. There were no announcements, no challenges issued. Yet quietly, his influence had grown. People trusted him. They relied on him. They saw in him a steady presence amid uncertainty. The city had not yet realized what was forming beneath its surface. But Frank had. The lessons of the past, the silence of the present, and the possibilities of the future were aligning. And somewhere within that alignment, the idea that would redefine Harlem's underworld was beginning to take shape. By the time the initial uncertainty after Bumpy Johnson's death began to settle, Frank Lucas had reached a quiet but decisive conclusion. The problem facing Harlem's drug trade was not competition on the streets. It was dependence at the source. For decades, black distributors had operated at the bottom of a rigid hierarchy, purchasing heroin from Italian mafia-controlled middlemen who dictated price, purity, and access. This arrangement limited profit and ensured permanent vulnerability. Frank saw it clearly. As long as someone else controlled supply, no amount of street power would ever translate into true independence. This realization did not come as a sudden flash of inspiration. It was the result of long observation, of listening to complaints whispered in back rooms and watching deals fall apart due to delays or manipulation. Frank understood systems, and he understood inefficiency. Every middleman represented both a cost and a risk. If one could be removed, the entire structure would shift. The idea he began to entertain was dangerous, even unthinkable to many. What if Harlem no longer relied on the mafia for heroin? What if the supply came directly from its source, bypassing every traditional gatekeeper? It was an idea that challenged not just logistics, but power itself. To attempt it openly would invite retaliation. To speak of it carelessly would be fatal. Frank kept these thoughts entirely to himself. He began by educating himself. Quietly, methodically, he learned everything he could about the heroin trade beyond New York. Where it originated. How it moved. Who controlled which routes. He listened to rumors about Southeast Asia, about vast quantities of opium moving through regions shaped by war and corruption. The Golden Triangle, spanning parts of Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, emerged repeatedly in these conversations. Frank paid attention. What made this region particularly interesting was its connection to the ongoing Vietnam War. American military presence created movement, infrastructure, and opportunity. Supplies flowed in and out constantly. Oversight was inconsistent. Corruption was widespread. Frank recognized that war, while devastating, also created shadows where illegal operations could thrive. If heroin could be sourced there and transported quietly, the implications would be enormous. Frank approached this challenge the same way he approached everything else, with patience. He did not rush to act. First, he assessed his own capacity. Did he have the discipline required? The loyalty? The ability to manage such a complex operation without drawing attention? He believed he did, but belief alone was not enough. He began identifying individuals who could help him navigate this new terrain. These were not flashy criminals or loud enforcers. He sought people with military experience, people who understood logistics, people who knew how to move through systems without being noticed. Trust was critical. Frank did not recruit widely. He selected carefully. One of the most radical aspects of Frank's thinking was his approach to quality. The heroin sold on New York streets was often diluted, cut multiple times as it passed through layers of distribution. This reduced its potency but increased profit for middlemen. Frank saw an opportunity to differentiate his product not through marketing, but through purity. If he could deliver heroin closer to its original form, he could control both pricing and loyalty. This strategy carried significant risk. Higher purity meant greater danger to users, and Frank was aware of this. But in the ruthless calculus of the drug trade, purity also meant dominance. Dealers would seek him out. Competitors would struggle to match his offering. The market would respond. As plans began to take shape, Frank remained outwardly unchanged. He did not alter his routines. He did not display new wealth or assert new authority. This consistency was deliberate. He understood that any visible shift in behavior could attract unwanted attention. His power would come from execution, not announcement. Behind the scenes, however, preparations intensified. Routes were mapped. Contacts established. Risks assessed. Frank understood that a single mistake could collapse everything. The mafia would not tolerate being bypassed. Law enforcement would be relentless if they discovered the scope of his operation. Failure would not be forgiven. What sustained Frank through this planning phase was his belief in structure. He was not interested in chaos or short-term gains. He wanted a system that functioned efficiently and quietly. One that could operate beneath the surface without constant intervention. This required discipline not just from him, but from everyone involved. Frank also understood the importance of timing. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of upheaval. Social movements, political unrest, and war stretched institutions thin. Law enforcement resources were divided. Attention was focused in many directions. Frank saw this as a narrow window of opportunity. Not a guarantee, but a chance. As he moved closer to action, Frank remained aware of the personal cost. This path would demand absolute control and constant vigilance. There would be no room for error, no safety net. The boy who had witnessed violence in the South had grown into a man willing to risk everything for autonomy. Power, to him, was no longer about survival alone. It was about insulation from vulnerability. The decision to cut out the middlemen marked a point of no return. Once taken, there would be no going back to the old ways. Frank understood this fully. He did not romanticize the move. He approached it with the same calm acceptance he had learned as a child. If this failed, the consequences would be severe. But doing nothing, remaining subordinate, carried its own kind of death. In choosing to challenge the existing order, Frank Lucas was not seeking recognition. He was seeking control over his fate. He believed that by mastering supply, he could master uncertainty. That by reducing dependence, he could reduce exposure. It was a calculated gamble, informed by years of observation and shaped by a lifetime of restraint. As the final pieces fell into place, Harlem remained unaware of what was coming. The streets moved as they always had, unaware that the foundation beneath them was about to shift. Frank Lucas, still quiet, still composed, stood on the edge of transformation. The most dangerous idea in his world was no longer just a thought. It was becoming reality. Far from the brick buildings of Harlem and the familiar rhythm of New York streets, another world existed, one shaped by humidity, conflict, and distance. It was a world where dense jungles pressed in on narrow airstrips, where rivers served as highways, and where the air carried the constant tension of war. This was Southeast Asia in the late 1960s, a region fractured by politics, colonial history, and the ongoing conflict in Vietnam. For Frank Lucas, it was not a place of ideology or allegiance. It was a source. The Golden Triangle, a remote region spanning parts of Laos, Thailand, and Burma, had long been one of the world's primary producers of opium. For generations, farmers cultivated poppies in the highlands, harvesting sap that would eventually be refined into heroin. What made this region uniquely valuable during this period was not just its production capacity, but the conditions surrounding it. War had disrupted traditional oversight. Military supply chains crisscrossed the area. Corruption was widespread, and enforcement was inconsistent. In chaos, opportunity flourished. Frank understood that sourcing heroin from this region would require more than money. It demanded access, protection, and an understanding of how war reshaped logistics. American military presence created both risk and cover. Planes flew regularly between Southeast Asia and the United States, carrying supplies, equipment, and personnel. Among these movements, things could be hidden. Frank saw this not as an exploit, but as a system already compromised by its own scale. He did not travel himself. That would have been unnecessary and dangerous. Instead, Frank relied on intermediaries with the right backgrounds. Men who had served in the military, who understood hierarchy and discretion, and who could move through military environments without raising suspicion. These individuals provided access to airfields, transport routes, and local contacts who could facilitate production and shipment. The process of turning raw opium into heroin required expertise. Laboratories, often hidden deep in the jungle or disguised as legitimate operations, refined the product. Frank's involvement at this stage was indirect but deliberate. He insisted on high standards. Purity mattered. Consistency mattered. He understood that control over quality would translate into control over the market back home. There has long been discussion about how the heroin was transported. One of the most infamous claims suggests that it was hidden inside the coffins of fallen American soldiers, exploiting the sanctity and lack of inspection associated with military repatriation. While this story has become part of Frank Lucas's legend, historians remain divided on its accuracy. What is clear is that military transport systems were used in some capacity, taking advantage of weak oversight and systemic corruption. The exact methods mattered less than the outcome. Large quantities of heroin reached the United States with remarkable efficiency. Frank's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his ability to integrate these distant operations into a coherent system. He did not micromanage. He set standards and selected people he trusted to meet them. This reduced the need for constant communication, lowering the risk of exposure. Each part of the operation functioned independently, yet contributed to a unified whole. The Vietnam War created a moral fog that blurred lines between right and wrong. Soldiers faced trauma, officials faced pressure, and local populations were caught in between. In such an environment, corruption thrived. Frank did not create these conditions. He exploited them. From his perspective, this was not an act of malice, but of opportunity. The world was already broken. He was simply navigating its fractures. Back in Harlem, few understood the scale of what was unfolding. To most, heroin was just another commodity, another vice moving through familiar channels. They did not see the global network forming behind it, stretching across continents and conflicts. Frank ensured that they didn't need to. The less people knew, the safer the operation remained. Managing this transnational supply chain required discipline and trust. Frank avoided unnecessary communication, limiting knowledge to those who absolutely needed it. He understood that information was a liability. The fewer people involved, the fewer points of failure. This approach mirrored his overall philosophy: reduce exposure, increase control. The risks, however, were immense. International trafficking invited scrutiny from multiple agencies. A single intercepted shipment could unravel everything. Frank accepted this risk with the same calm resolve that had defined his life. He believed that careful planning and disciplined execution could mitigate danger, though never eliminate it. As shipments began to arrive, the impact was immediate. Harlem's heroin supply changed. The product was purer, more consistent, and cheaper than what competitors could offer. Dealers noticed. Users noticed. Demand surged. Frank had achieved what few thought possible: he had disrupted an entrenched system by operating beyond its reach. This success did not make him reckless. On the contrary, it reinforced his commitment to discretion. He resisted the temptation to expand too quickly or draw attention to his role. Others took credit. Others absorbed risk. Frank remained in the background, ensuring that the machinery continued to function. The connection between war and drugs is an uncomfortable one. It reveals how conflict creates spaces where morality erodes and exploitation thrives. Frank Lucas's operation was a product of this environment. It was enabled by systemic failures and human desperation. Understanding this context does not excuse the harm caused, but it does explain how such an operation could exist. As the flow of heroin from Southeast Asia to New York stabilized, Frank's position strengthened. He had achieved independence from the mafia supply chain, altering the balance of power in Harlem. This shift would have profound consequences, both for those who benefited from it and for those who suffered its effects. The jungles of Southeast Asia and the streets of Harlem were now connected by an invisible thread, one woven through war, corruption, and ambition. Frank Lucas stood at the center of this connection, still quiet, still calculated, and now more powerful than ever. The world around him, however, was beginning to feel the weight of what he had set in motion. When the first steady shipments reached New York, the change was subtle at first. There were no announcements, no sudden explosions of violence, no dramatic shifts that caught the public eye. Instead, word traveled the way it always had in Harlem, quietly, from one trusted voice to another. Dealers noticed the difference immediately. The product was cleaner, stronger, and more consistent than anything they had handled before. It moved faster, sold easier, and left less room for negotiation. Without meaning to, Frank Lucas had introduced a new standard. He named the heroin Blue Magic, not as a marketing gimmick, but as a marker of reliability. The name itself was rarely spoken loudly. It did not need to be. In a world where reputation meant everything, consistency was more powerful than slogans. Blue Magic delivered what it promised, every time. For street-level dealers, this reliability translated into trust. For Frank, it translated into control. Unlike traditional operations, where heroin was cut repeatedly as it passed through multiple hands, Frank's supply arrived closer to its original purity. This allowed him to dictate how and where it would be diluted, if at all. By controlling this process, he controlled pricing and loyalty. Dealers who worked with him could outcompete rivals. Customers sought out his product. The market responded exactly as Frank had predicted. This dominance did not come without consequences. Higher purity increased the risk to users, a reality that Frank was fully aware of. Overdoses became more frequent. Addiction deepened. Families suffered. Entire blocks felt the weight of a substance that moved silently but left devastation in its wake. Frank did not confront these outcomes directly. His focus remained on structure and control. In his mind, responsibility ended where the transaction did. This detachment allowed him to operate without hesitation, but it also deepened the moral divide between his success and the suffering around him. As blue magic spread through Harlem, money followed. Cash flowed steadily, predictably, and in staggering amounts. Frank handled this influx with the same discipline he applied to every aspect of his operation. He avoided banks when possible, preferring to store money physically, hidden in places that did not draw attention. He did not indulge in immediate excess. For the most part, his lifestyle remained understated. This restraint confused both rivals and law enforcement. In a world where wealth was often displayed as proof of power, Frank's modest appearance worked as camouflage. He dressed neatly but plainly, drove ordinary cars, and moved through the city without an entourage. Those who expected a king to look like one never noticed him. Behind the scenes, however, his organization grew more sophisticated. Distribution networks expanded, reaching beyond Harlem into other parts of New York and eventually other cities. Each expansion was calculated. Frank avoided overextension, preferring depth of control over breadth of territory. He believed that managing fewer areas well was safer than spreading thin. He also insisted on discipline within his ranks. Violence was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. Attention was the enemy. Those who brought unnecessary heat were removed quickly. Frank understood that chaos attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny threatened everything he had built. His leadership style was firm but quiet, mirroring the lessons he had learned from Bumpy Johnson. As Blue Magic's reputation grew, so did whispers. Competitors wondered how Frank had managed to bypass the mafia's grip on supply. Some suspected international connections. Others believed he had protection at high levels. Few knew the truth, and fewer still dared to ask. Frank's silence fueled speculation, which in turn discouraged confrontation. Uncertainty became another layer of protection. The Italian mafia, accustomed to controlling the heroin trade, began to notice the shift. Their middlemen felt the loss first, as dealers turned elsewhere for better product and pricing. This erosion of influence did not go unnoticed. Frank was aware of the danger this posed. Challenging established power structures invited retaliation. But by the time they realized the extent of his operation, it was already deeply entrenched. Frank navigated this tension carefully. He did not provoke openly. He did not boast. He allowed others to assume he was a minor player, a distributor benefiting temporarily from favorable circumstances. Meanwhile, his infrastructure continued to strengthen. Each successful transaction reinforced his position. The streets of Harlem changed as blue magic took hold. Addiction intensified, but so did dependency on Frank's supply. He had not only altered the drug market, he had reshaped the neighborhood's economy. Money flowed upward, stabilizing certain operations while destabilizing others. Power shifted subtly, often without those affected fully understanding how or why. Through it all, Frank remained composed. He did not celebrate victories or dwell on losses. His focus was always forward, on maintaining equilibrium. He understood that success attracted attention, and attention demanded caution. The more blue magic dominated the market, the greater the risk of exposure. Law enforcement, slow to adapt, struggled to identify the source of this new wave. Arrests continued at street level, but they revealed little. Those caught knew only fragments of the operation. Frank had designed it that way. Information was compartmentalized. No one knew more than they needed to. This fragmentation protected the core. The contrast between Frank's internal world and the external consequences of his empire was stark. While neighborhoods grappled with increased addiction and loss, Frank refined logistics and supply. He viewed the operation as a system, not a social force. This perspective allowed him to function without emotional interference, but it also ensured that the harm caused by blue magic would echo long after his rise. As months turned into years, Frank Lucas solidified his status as Harlem's quiet king. Not through fear or spectacle, but through reliability and control. Blue magic was more than a product. It was a symbol of his approach, clean, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Yet beneath this stability, pressure was building. Dominance invites challenge. Success invites scrutiny. And no system, no matter how carefully constructed, can remain invisible forever. Frank understood this. Even as his empire reached its peak, he remained alert, aware that every rise carries the seed of its own decline. At the height of his power, Frank Lucas looked nothing like the man most people imagined when they thought of a drug kingpin. There were no flashy entrances, no loud displays of wealth, no entourage announcing his arrival. He moved through Harlem and the rest of New York like an ordinary man with ordinary concerns. This was not an accident. It was a carefully maintained strategy, one rooted in everything he had learned since childhood. Frank believed that visibility was a weakness, and he treated attention as a threat to be managed, not a reward to be enjoyed. While others in the drug trade measured success by how feared they were or how extravagantly they lived, Frank measured success by how unnoticed he remained. He understood that law enforcement was drawn to patterns and appearances. Expensive cars, loud clubs, public arguments, and visible hierarchies all created trails. Frank avoided these trails meticulously. He dressed well, but not memorably. His clothes were clean, tailored, and understated. He favored simplicity over luxury, blending in with businessmen, churchgoers, and commuters alike. This quiet approach extended to how he conducted business. Meetings were brief and purposeful. Conversations were short and often indirect. Frank rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. His authority was understood, not enforced through intimidation. People followed his instructions because doing so made sense. The system worked. Money was made. Problems were minimized. In a world driven by ego, Frank's lack of it became his greatest advantage. His daily routines were deliberately unremarkable. He woke early, kept regular hours, and avoided unnecessary socializing. There were no late-night parties or reckless behavior to draw suspicion. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, he appeared disciplined, even dull. This normalcy created a kind of invisibility cloak. It allowed him to move freely without attracting curiosity. Despite the massive amounts of money flowing through his operation, Frank was careful with spending. He did not trust banks, understanding that large deposits could raise questions. Instead, cash was stored discreetly, often hidden in plain sight. He treated money as a tool, not a symbol. Its purpose was to sustain the system, not to announce success. This restraint was unusual in the criminal world and often misunderstood. Some mistook it for a lack of ambition. Others assumed he was merely a middleman, benefiting temporarily from favorable circumstances. Frank allowed these misconceptions to persist. Underestimation, he believed, was a form of protection. Behind this modest exterior, however, was a mind constantly calculating risk. Frank understood that power brought paranoia. Every new connection, every expansion of territory, increased the chance of betrayal or exposure. To manage this, he maintained strict boundaries. Information was compartmentalized. Trust was earned slowly and revoked quickly. Those who violated his rules were removed without drama. Frank also avoided cultivating a public reputation. He did not seek headlines or stories. When others bragged about their exploits, he listened silently. He knew that stories had a way of reaching ears they were not intended for. Silence, once again, served him better than speech. His interactions with law enforcement, when they occurred, were polite and uneventful. He understood that hostility invited attention. Cooperation, within limits, maintained the illusion of normalcy. To police officers, he was just another face in the crowd, not worth special notice. This period of his life was defined by control, but also by constant vigilance. Frank never fully relaxed. He knew that his empire existed in a fragile balance, dependent on secrecy and discipline. One mistake, one moment of indulgence, could unravel everything. This awareness shaped his behavior, keeping him grounded even as his influence grew. The contrast between Frank and other powerful figures of the era was stark. While others used fear to dominate, Frank used efficiency. While others sought admiration, Frank sought stability. This approach allowed him to operate at a scale few could match, yet remain largely unknown to the public. Harlem itself reflected this paradox. On the surface, life continued as usual. Beneath it, an enormous operation functioned smoothly, feeding addiction, generating wealth, and reshaping the neighborhood's economy. Frank was at the center of it all, yet rarely seen as such. His ability to remain quiet did not mean he lacked confidence. On the contrary, it required immense self-control. Resisting the urge to display success, to claim credit, to intimidate rivals, these were daily choices. Frank believed that ego destroyed more empires than enemies ever could. As time passed, his reputation among those who mattered grew, even if his name remained obscure to outsiders. Dealers knew his product was reliable. Associates knew his word could be trusted. Rivals knew that crossing him carried consequences, even if those consequences were delivered silently. This quiet dominance created a sense of inevitability. Frank did not need to assert himself because the system itself enforced his authority. People adjusted their behavior around him instinctively. They spoke carefully, acted cautiously, and respected boundaries. Yet even in this period of apparent stability, subtle cracks began to form. Success attracted curiosity. Whispers grew louder. Law enforcement, though slow to recognize Frank himself, began to sense that something had changed in Harlem's drug trade. Patterns shifted. Supply became more consistent. Profits increased without an obvious source. Frank noticed these signs as well. He remained calm, but alert. He adjusted routines, reinforced discipline, and reminded himself of the lessons that had brought him this far. The louder others became, the quieter he remained. This was the essence of Frank Lucas at his peak, a man who understood that true power did not need witnesses. A man who ruled not through spectacle, but through systems. A man who believed that the safest place to stand was just outside the spotlight. For a time, this philosophy worked flawlessly. The city moved around him, unaware of the extent of his influence. Frank Lucas, the quiet king of Harlem, continued to operate beneath the noise, confident that silence, carefully maintained, would keep him untouchable. As Frank Lucas's operation grew more complex and profitable, one principle remained constant at its core: trust had to be controlled. In a world where loyalty was often temporary and betrayal could come from the most familiar faces, Frank believed that the safest circle was the smallest one. This belief shaped one of his most defining decisions, placing family at the center of his organization. Frank did not romanticize family. His upbringing had taught him that blood alone did not guarantee safety. Yet he also understood that shared history created leverage, obligation, and accountability in ways that casual partnerships could not. By involving relatives, he reduced the risk of random betrayal, while increasing his ability to enforce discipline without drawing attention. His brothers, cousins, and close kin were given roles that mattered. Not symbolic positions, but functional ones: transportation, distribution oversight, enforcement of rules. Each role came with clear expectations. Family was not an excuse for failure. In fact, Frank often demanded more from them than he did from outsiders. Mistakes were not tolerated simply because of blood ties. This structure created a sense of internal cohesion. Decisions moved quickly. Instructions were understood without lengthy explanations. Disputes were resolved privately. To outsiders, the organization appeared loosely connected, but at its core was a tightly bound unit that answered to Frank alone. Frank's leadership within his family was firm, sometimes severe. He did not allow personal relationships to interfere with business decisions. This emotional distance was deliberate. He believed that blurred boundaries weakened control. By maintaining authority even at home, he reinforced the idea that the operation came first. At the same time, this approach planted seeds of tension. Family members lived under constant pressure to perform and remain silent. The rewards were substantial, but so were the risks. Wealth brought temptation. Power bred ego. Frank understood this and watched closely for signs of drift. To manage these dynamics, he emphasized routine and structure. Roles were clearly defined. Communication followed established channels. No one acted independently. This rigidity reduced chaos, but it also created strain. Some family members chafed under the restrictions, longing for recognition or freedom. Frank saw these desires as threats, not aspirations. Beyond family, Frank maintained a limited inner circle of trusted associates. These were individuals who had proven themselves over time, demonstrating discipline and discretion. Even so, they were kept at arm's length from the operations core. Frank compartmentalized information carefully. No one knew everything. This fragmentation ensured that a single betrayal could not dismantle the entire system. Paranoia, while dangerous, served a purpose. Frank did not trust easily, and he believed that trust should never be unconditional. He monitored behavior, watched for changes in routine, and listened for inconsistencies. This vigilance kept his organization intact, but it also isolated him. True companionship was rare. Conversations were guarded. Relaxation was limited. At home, this tension manifested subtly. Frank's relationships were shaped by control rather than intimacy. He provided materially, but emotionally he remained distant. Family gatherings were calm, almost formal. Laughter existed, but it was measured. Everyone understood the boundaries, even if they were never spoken aloud. The presence of family within the operation also heightened the stakes. Law enforcement pressure did not threaten just Frank, but those he cared about. This added a layer of anxiety that he carried silently. Protecting the system now meant protecting his bloodline. Failure would not only cost freedom, but legacy. Frank justified this risk through belief in discipline. He believed that if everyone followed the rules, the system would endure. He reminded his family often that attention was dangerous. Flashy behavior, careless talk, or public disputes were forbidden. Those who violated these rules faced swift consequences, regardless of relation. This environment bred compliance, but not necessarily peace. Some family members struggled under the weight of expectation. They were wealthy but constrained, powerful but monitored. Frank recognized this tension but did not soften his approach. From his perspective, comfort bred carelessness. Outside the family, rumors circulated about Frank's control. Some admired it, seeing a man who had built something unbreakable. Others feared it, interpreting his quiet authority as coldness. Frank did not concern himself with these opinions. Reputation, he believed, was secondary to function. As the operation continued to expand, the complexity of managing loyalty increased. More money meant more temptation. More exposure meant more risk. Frank responded by tightening control rather than loosening it. He centralized decision-making, limited access, and reinforced discipline. This concentration of power, while effective, also created vulnerability. The system depended heavily on Frank's judgment and presence. If he faltered, there was no clear successor. Family loyalty ensured obedience, but it did not guarantee vision. Frank was aware of this, but he trusted his own ability to maintain balance. Emotionally, this period was marked by isolation. Frank had achieved everything he set out to achieve: control, independence, security. Yet the cost was constant vigilance. There was no room for relaxation, no safe space where he could let his guard down completely. Power demanded attention at all times. Despite this, Frank remained composed. He did not allow stress to show. To those around him, he appeared steady, unshaken. This composure reinforced his authority and discouraged challenges. People followed him because he seemed unbreakable. The irony of his approach was that the very measures designed to protect him also narrowed his world. Trust became transactional. Relationships became conditional. Family became both shield and liability. Frank accepted this trade-off without complaint. In his mind, safety required sacrifice. As time passed, the strain of this tightly controlled environment began to show in small ways: whispers of dissatisfaction, subtle deviations from routine, moments of carelessness. Frank noticed each one. He corrected them swiftly, believing that vigilance could prevent collapse. For now, his inner circle held. Loyalty, enforced by structure and fear of consequence, remained intact. The quiet king continued to rule from the center of his carefully managed world, aware that every empire, no matter how controlled, rests on human foundations, and humans are never entirely predictable. For years, Frank Lucas had mastered the art of invisibility. He moved carefully, avoided spectacle, and allowed others to draw attention while he remained just outside the frame. It was a discipline he enforced relentlessly, both on himself and on those around him. And then, in a single evening, that discipline cracked, not through violence or betrayal, but through a moment of human indulgence. The night of the Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight in 1971 was electric. Madison Square Garden buzzed with anticipation, the kind that makes even the air feel charged. This was more than a boxing match. It was an event that drew celebrities, politicians, athletes, and powerful figures from every corner of society. Cameras flashed constantly, capturing faces and moments destined for newspapers and television screens. For Frank, this environment was everything he usually avoided. Yet on this night, he made a choice that would haunt him. Instead of blending into the background, he sat ringside. Not only that, he wore a lavish chinchilla coat, reportedly costing tens of thousands of dollars, a striking contrast to his usual modest appearance. The coat was bold, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Against the sea of suits and familiar faces, Frank stood out. To him, it may have felt like a small indulgence. A rare moment to enjoy the fruits of his success. After years of restraint, perhaps he believed he had earned it. Or perhaps he underestimated how closely the world watched events like this. Whatever the reason, the decision marked a turning point. Sitting nearby were seasoned law enforcement officers, including members of the DEA and NYPD, accustomed to recognizing power. They scanned the crowd not just for criminals, but for anomalies. Men who didn't fit the expected profiles. When they saw Frank, unknown yet visibly wealthy, seated among established figures, questions formed immediately. Who was he? How did he afford that seat, that coat, that presence? The coat itself became a symbol, not just of wealth, but of contradiction. Frank Lucas, a man with no public reputation, no known business ventures, and no visible source of income, suddenly appeared at one of the most photographed events of the year, dressed like royalty. It did not take long for curiosity to turn into suspicion. In the days that followed, whispers circulated within law enforcement circles. Photos were examined. Faces were compared. Background checks began. Frank's name, previously buried in minor reports and peripheral mentions, surfaced again and again. Each inquiry revealed little, but the lack of explanation only deepened interest. Frank sensed the shift almost immediately. He had lived too long by instinct not to feel when the air changed. The streets did not look different, but the rhythm felt altered. He noticed unfamiliar faces lingering longer than usual. Conversations ended more abruptly. He understood that the coat had broken his cover. This realization did not cause panic. Frank was not a man who reacted emotionally. Instead, he adjusted. He pulled back further, tightened routines, and reinforced silence within his organization. He reminded his family and associates of the rules, emphasizing discretion with renewed urgency. But some damage could not be undone. Law enforcement began to map patterns. They noticed the consistency of heroin supply, the unusual purity, and the way certain neighborhoods seemed insulated from the shortages that plagued others. Arrests at street level yielded similar stories. Dealers spoke of a source they did not know, a product that arrived reliably, instructions that were precise but distant. Frank's name surfaced more frequently, often accompanied by uncertainty. He was not yet identified as the kingpin, but he was no longer invisible. That alone represented a dangerous shift. Frank had always believed that survival depended on remaining beneath notice. Now, eyes were turning his way. The irony of the moment was not lost on him. After years of avoiding excess, it was not a violent act or betrayal that exposed him, but a moment of pride. A single night of indulgence had undone years of discipline. This realization weighed heavily, though he did not show it. Within his organization, the effects were subtle but real. Tension increased. Associates sensed the heightened vigilance and understood that something had changed. Frank did not explain. He never needed to. His tightened control spoke for him. Meetings became even shorter. Instructions more precise. Mistakes less forgivable. Despite this, Frank remained confident in the structure he had built. His operation was still compartmentalized. No one person could expose the whole. He trusted that even if law enforcement pressure increased, the system could withstand it. Yet beneath that confidence lay an awareness that the margin for error had narrowed. The chinchilla coat became legend almost instantly. Among those in the underworld, it was spoken of as a rare misstep by a man otherwise defined by caution. Among law enforcement, it became the thread that unraveled the mystery. That image, an unknown man in luxury, refused to fade. Frank returned to his usual appearance quickly, abandoning extravagance and resuming his low-profile routines. But the memory lingered. Once seen, he could not be unseen. The coat had announced his existence to a world trained to notice anomalies. As surveillance increased, Frank relied more heavily on his discipline. He avoided public spaces, delegated cautiously, and limited movement. He knew that law enforcement investigations moved slowly, building cases piece by piece. Time, he hoped, would work in his favor. If he remained patient, perhaps attention would drift elsewhere. Yet the seeds had been planted. Investigators like Richie Roberts began to focus more intently, sensing that beneath Harlem's calm surface lay something organized, efficient, and unusually disciplined. The coat had given them a face to attach to that intuition. Frank Lucas had always believed that power lay in silence. On that night at Madison Square Garden, silence was replaced by spectacle, if only briefly. And in that brief moment, the balance shifted. The quiet king had stepped into the light, and the light had noticed him. Once Frank Lucas's presence registered on the radar of law enforcement, the machinery of investigation began to turn, slowly at first, then with growing momentum. This was not the kind of pursuit marked by flashing lights and dramatic raids. It was patient, methodical, and relentless. The kind Frank himself respected, because it mirrored his own approach to building power. What had once been a vague sense that something unusual was happening in Harlem now began to solidify into focused suspicion. Among those drawn into this unfolding inquiry was a small group of investigators who did not fit the typical mold. They were not dazzled by headlines or driven by quick arrests. They were interested in patterns, in systems, in inconsistencies that pointed toward something larger. One of them, a young and meticulous prosecutor named Richie Roberts, would become central to what followed. Roberts approached crime the way Frank approached business, quietly, analytically, and without unnecessary theatrics. While many officers focused on street-level busts and visible dealers, Roberts was troubled by what he could not see. Heroin was flooding Harlem with a consistency that defied logic. Arrests did little to disrupt supply. Prices remained stable. Purity remained high. These were signs of a well-organized source operating above the usual chaos. Investigators began pulling old files, tracing minor arrests and peripheral mentions that had once seemed insignificant. Frank Lucas's name appeared sporadically, never at the center, always just off to the side. This absence of prominence was itself suspicious. In the drug trade, major players usually left trails, associates talking too much, flashy behavior, or prior convictions that hinted at scale. Frank had none of these. That made him harder to define, but more interesting. Surveillance increased quietly. Unmarked cars lingered. Phones were monitored. Movements were logged. Frank noticed, as he always did. He adjusted routes, altered routines, and reduced direct contact. But surveillance, once initiated, rarely disappears entirely. It simply evolves. What frustrated law enforcement most was the lack of clear entry points. Street-level dealers knew little. Couriers carried instructions, not information. Even those arrested multiple times could not identify the source of blue magic. Frank's compartmentalized structure did exactly what it was designed to do, absorb pressure without collapsing. Roberts and his colleagues shifted tactics. If they could not penetrate from the bottom, they would map outward. Financial irregularities became a focus. Unexplained wealth, property transactions, and cash movement were examined carefully. This approach required time and cooperation across agencies, something not easily achieved. Bureaucracy slowed progress. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated coordination. At the same time, internal corruption within law enforcement created blind spots. Frank's operation had benefited, indirectly, from officers willing to look the other way or accept bribes. Roberts was acutely aware of this problem. He understood that to dismantle an operation like Frank's, the investigation had to be clean. Any hint of corruption could compromise the entire case. This insistence on integrity isolated Roberts at times. He was cautious about whom he trusted, aware that leaks could tip off targets. This mirrored Frank's own paranoia, creating a strange symmetry between hunter and hunted. Both men valued discipline. Both believed that patience was more powerful than force. As months passed, the investigation deepened. Wiretaps were authorized. Patterns emerged. Frank's name surfaced more frequently in conversations, often indirectly. References to the man, the source, or the quiet one appeared in intercepted communications. Each fragment added to a growing mosaic. Frank responded by tightening control further. He reduced communication, relying on intermediaries and coded language. Meetings became rarer. Instructions were delivered through trusted family members. He believed that by minimizing exposure, he could outlast the investigation. After all, law enforcement attention ebbed and flowed. If he remained disciplined, perhaps they would move on. But Roberts did not move on. He sensed that this case represented something larger than a single trafficker. It exposed vulnerabilities within the system, how easily large-scale operations could hide behind bureaucracy, prejudice, and assumptions. Frank's ability to operate invisibly was not just a personal triumph. It was a systemic failure. As pressure mounted, small cracks began to form. Associates grew nervous. Minor mistakes occurred. A courier missed a pickup. A phone call lasted too long. None of these incidents were catastrophic, but they accumulated. Frank noticed each one, correcting and containing, but the margin for error continued to shrink. Law enforcement capitalized on these moments. Arrests were timed carefully. Plea deals were offered strategically. Investigators looked for the weakest links, those most likely to break under pressure. Frank's reliance on family reduced random betrayal, but it did not eliminate fear. The threat of long prison sentences weighed heavily. The investigation also began to expose corruption within the police department itself. Roberts uncovered officers who had been protecting drug operations in exchange for money. This discovery complicated matters but also strengthened the case. It revealed the environment that had allowed Frank's empire to flourish. Bringing these officers to justice became part of the mission. Frank watched these developments with concern. The arrest of corrupt officers signaled a shift. It meant that the system was turning inward, cleaning itself. This reduced his ability to rely on institutional blind spots. He understood that once law enforcement committed to reform, operations like his became far more vulnerable. Despite this, Frank did not flee or dismantle his operation. He believed that running would confirm guilt and invite immediate pursuit. Instead, he doubled down on caution. He limited travel, avoided public appearances, and trusted that his structure could withstand scrutiny. The tension during this period was palpable, though rarely visible. Harlem continued its routines. Streets buzzed with life. Beneath that surface, a quiet contest unfolded between two disciplined minds. One built an empire through silence. The other sought to dismantle it through patience. Frank Lucas had always believed that systems outlast individuals. Now he was testing that belief against an equally determined system, one with resources he could not fully see or control. Each day passed without arrest felt like a small victory. Each new surveillance report felt like a warning. The hunt had truly begun. And for the first time since his rise, Frank was no longer in complete control of the game. As the investigation tightened, the atmosphere around Frank Lucas's operation began to change in ways that could not be fully contained by discipline alone. What had once felt like a smoothly functioning machine now carried an undercurrent of anxiety. The system still worked, but it no longer felt effortless. Every movement required more caution, every decision more deliberation. The weight of constant scrutiny pressed down on everyone involved, even those who knew only fragments of the larger picture. Frank sensed this shift immediately. He had always believed that pressure revealed weakness, and now that pressure was everywhere. Associates spoke more carefully. Family members grew tense. Small delays, once inconsequential, became sources of concern. The rhythm that had sustained the operation for years was faltering, if only slightly. But in a world built on precision, even small disruptions mattered. Paranoia, once a useful tool, began to spread beyond Frank's control. Where he had used suspicion to maintain discipline, others now used it to justify hesitation and secrecy. Communication slowed. Trust frayed. People began second-guessing one another, wondering who might break under pressure. Frank worked to contain this, reminding everyone of the rules, reinforcing structure, but fear has a way of seeping into places where rules cannot reach. Law enforcement capitalized on these cracks. Arrests were no longer random or reactive. They were strategic, timed to maximize psychological impact. When one associate was taken in, word spread quickly. Even if the arrest yielded little information, it sent a message: no one was untouchable. Frank understood this tactic well. He had used similar strategies to assert control on the streets. The greatest threat did not come from rivals or violence, but from human vulnerability. Long sentences loomed. Families worried. Loyalty was tested not by money, but by fear of losing everything. Frank knew that discipline could not fully shield against this. No system, no matter how well designed, could eliminate the human element. To manage these dynamics, he emphasized routine and structure. Roles were clearly defined. Communication followed established channels. No one acted independently. This rigidity reduced chaos, but it also created strain. Some family members chafed under the restrictions, longing for recognition or freedom. Frank saw these desires as threats, not aspirations. Beyond family, Frank maintained a limited inner circle of trusted associates. These were individuals who had proven themselves over time, demonstrating discipline and discretion. Even so, they were kept at arm's length from the operation's core. Frank compartmentalized information carefully. No one knew everything. This fragmentation ensured that a single betrayal could not dismantle the entire system. Paranoia, while dangerous, served a purpose. Frank did not trust easily, and he believed that trust should never be unconditional. He monitored behavior, watched for changes in routine, and listened for inconsistencies. This vigilance kept his organization intact, but it also isolated him. True companionship was rare. Conversations were guarded. Relaxation was limited. At home, this tension manifested subtly. Frank's relationships were shaped by control rather than intimacy. He provided materially, but emotionally he remained distant. Family gatherings were calm, almost formal. Laughter existed, but it was measured. Everyone understood the boundaries, even if they were never spoken aloud. The presence of family within the operation also heightened the stakes. Law enforcement pressure did not threaten just Frank, but those he cared about. This added a layer of anxiety that he carried silently. Protecting the system now meant protecting his bloodline. Failure would not only cost freedom, but legacy. Frank justified this risk through belief in discipline. He believed that if everyone followed the rules, the system would endure. He reminded his family often that attention was dangerous. Flashy behavior, careless talk, or public disputes were forbidden. Those who violated these rules faced swift consequences, regardless of relation. This environment bred compliance, but not necessarily peace. Some family members struggled under the weight of expectation. They were wealthy but constrained, powerful but monitored. Frank recognized this tension but did not soften his approach. From his perspective, comfort bred carelessness. Outside the family, rumors circulated about Frank's control. Some admired it, seeing a man who had built something unbreakable. Others feared it, interpreting his quiet authority as coldness. Frank did not concern himself with these opinions. Reputation, he believed, was secondary to function. As the operation continued to expand, the complexity of managing loyalty increased. More money meant more temptation. More exposure meant more risk. Frank responded by tightening control rather than loosening it. He centralized decision-making, limited access, and reinforced discipline. This concentration of power, while effective, also created vulnerability. Some within his circle began making mistakes. A careless conversation. A routine broken. A meeting held at the wrong time. Each error, minor on its own, added to the growing web of suspicion. Frank addressed these issues swiftly, but correction could not erase what had already been noticed. The pressure also strained family relationships. Those who had once accepted strict control began questioning the cost. Wealth no longer felt like protection. Instead, it became a burden, something that drew attention and envy. Frank noticed the change in tone, the subtle resentment, but he did not relax his standards. In his mind, lowering discipline would only hasten collapse. At the same time, law enforcement intensified its efforts to turn insiders. Plea deals were offered. Sentences were reduced in exchange for cooperation. These offers created impossible choices. To remain loyal meant risking decades in prison. To betray meant living with the consequences of that choice, both legal and personal. Frank believed that family loyalty would hold. Blood, he assumed, carried weight that fear could not easily erase. But even family had limits. Some members struggled with the reality of what they faced. The silence that had once been a source of strength became suffocating. As the investigation progressed, information began to leak in fragments. Not enough to destroy the operation outright, but enough to give law enforcement a clearer picture. Names, locations, patterns. Each fragment tightened the net. Frank responded by pulling back further. He reduced his direct involvement, delegating more responsibility while maintaining oversight. This created distance, but it also increased reliance on others at a time when trust was eroding. The very structure designed to protect him now depended on people under extreme pressure. The emotional toll on Frank himself was significant, though he rarely showed it. Years of vigilance had hardened him, but constant threat wore down even the most disciplined mind. Sleep became lighter. Thoughts lingered. The certainty that had guided his rise was replaced by a constant calculation of risk. He reflected often on the choices that had brought him here. Cutting out the middlemen had given him power, but it had also placed him squarely in the crosshairs of forces far larger than himself. The quiet approach that once shielded him now felt fragile. Silence, once protective, now felt heavy. Within Harlem, the effects of this unraveling were subtle. The streets did not erupt. Business continued. But those close to the operation sensed the change. There was less confidence, more caution. The certainty that Frank's system would always function began to fade. Law enforcement, sensing momentum, pressed harder. Surveillance intensified. Wiretaps yielded more information. Financial investigations uncovered inconsistencies. The case was coming together, piece by piece. Frank remained outwardly calm. He did not lash out or make desperate moves. He believed that panic would only confirm guilt. Instead, he focused on minimizing damage, containing fallout, and maintaining control for as long as possible. Yet even as he worked to hold the system together, he understood that time was no longer on his side. Every day increased the likelihood of betrayal, error, or exposure. The empire he had built so carefully was beginning to strain under its own weight. This phase of his life was defined not by dramatic collapse, but by slow erosion. Trust, once solid, became brittle. Discipline, once automatic, required constant reinforcement. Power, once effortless, demanded relentless attention. Frank Lucas, the man who had mastered silence and control, now faced the limits of both. The cracks were forming, not from a single blow, but from the cumulative pressure of fear, scrutiny, and human frailty. And as those cracks widened, the fall he had long tried to avoid drew ever closer. The end did not arrive with chaos or spectacle. There were no sirens screaming through Harlem streets in the middle of the night, no sudden gunfire, no frantic attempts to flee. True to the pattern of Frank Lucas's life, the moment of collapse came quietly, with an air of inevitability. By the time law enforcement moved in, the outcome had already been decided. The investigation had reached critical mass. Years of surveillance, intercepted communications, financial analysis, and witness cooperation had converged into a clear picture. The system that once seemed invisible was now mapped in detail. Every compartment Frank had designed to protect himself had slowed investigators at first, but in time, those same compartments revealed patterns. The silence that once concealed him could no longer do so. Frank was arrested without resistance. There was no point in struggling. He understood the moment instantly, not as a shock, but as a confirmation. The quiet king, who had always believed in accepting reality as it was, did not protest. He did not argue. He observed. The arrest was precise and controlled, reflecting the methodical nature of the case built against him. Law enforcement moved through properties associated with Frank and his organization, seizing large amounts of cash, documents, and evidence that spoke to the scale of his operation. Rooms filled with neatly stacked money told a story more powerful than any testimony. This was not the work of a street dealer. It was the remains of an empire. As news spread, the reaction in Harlem was muted. There was surprise, yes, but not disbelief. Those closest to the operation had sensed the tightening grip of law enforcement. For others, Frank had been little more than a name, if that. His arrest did not create immediate upheaval. The streets continued their rhythm. Life moved on. For Frank, the days following his arrest unfolded slowly. Interrogations were conducted calmly. Questions were asked, answers weighed carefully. Frank did not speak freely. He had spent a lifetime controlling information, and that discipline did not vanish in custody. He listened more than he talked, measuring each moment. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The scope of the operation, once hidden, was now undeniable. Supply routes, distribution networks, financial flows, everything that had functioned in silence was laid bare. Frank understood the implications immediately. The charges he faced carried the potential for life imprisonment. This realization did not produce panic. It produced calculation. Frank had always approached danger with a clear eye. Now, he assessed his options. The system he had built was gone. Loyalty, while still present, could not alter the facts. The law was no longer an abstract force. It was immediate and unforgiving. As he sat in holding cells and interview rooms, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The South. Harlem. Bumpy Johnson. Blue Magic. Each step had been logical at the time, each decision rooted in survival and control. The arrest did not invalidate those choices, but it did expose their limits. The contrast between his former power and his current position was stark. A man who once controlled supply lines stretching across the globe now waited behind locked doors. Yet even in this loss of freedom, Frank retained his composure. He did not plead. He did not boast. He accepted. Family members were also taken into custody, questioned, and charged. This weighed heavily on Frank, though he rarely expressed it. He had built his operation around family for protection, and now that same structure magnified the consequences. The realization was sobering. Power had not shielded them. It had exposed them. In court, the case against Frank unfolded methodically. Prosecutors presented evidence with precision, laying out the architecture of his empire piece by piece. Witnesses testified. Records were examined. The image of Frank Lucas as a quiet, modest figure was replaced by one of scale and control. Frank watched these proceedings with detached focus. He understood the narrative being constructed and recognized its accuracy. There was little room for denial. The question was no longer whether he would be convicted, but what he would do next. The arrest marked the definitive end of his reign. There would be no return to power, no rebuilding in shadows. The system he had mastered was now being used against him. Surveillance, structure, discipline, all the tools he valued, had become instruments of his downfall. Yet even in defeat, Frank did not collapse emotionally. He did not rage against fate. He accepted the outcome as the final phase of a cycle he had long understood. Rise and fall were inseparable. Control was always temporary. The quiet nature of his arrest underscored a central truth of his life. Loud men fell loudly. Quiet men fell quietly. There was no spectacle to remember, no dramatic image to freeze in time. Just a man standing at the end of a long, calculated path. As the doors closed behind him and the noise of the outside world faded, Frank Lucas entered a new reality. One defined not by control, but by confinement. The empire was over. What remained was reflection, consequence, and the long silence of accountability. With the weight of the evidence pressing down on him and the reality of a life sentence looming, Frank Lucas faced the most consequential decision of his life. For decades, he had survived by silence, by controlling information and revealing nothing that could be used against him. Now, silence no longer offered protection. The system he had outmaneuvered for so long had finally enclosed him, and survival required a different strategy. The option placed before him was clear, though deeply conflicted. Cooperation. In exchange for information, for names and systems laid bare, the government would consider reducing his sentence. It was a proposition that cut against everything Frank believed in. Loyalty, discipline, and silence had defined his rise. To cooperate meant dismantling not only his operation, but the unspoken code he had lived by. Frank did not decide immediately. He listened. He evaluated. He measured consequences the way he always had, without emotion. The numbers were stark. Without cooperation, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. With cooperation, there was a possibility, only a possibility, of eventual release. The choice was not moral in the abstract. It was practical. There was also the matter of corruption. As the investigation had unfolded, it became clear that Frank's success had been enabled, in part, by compromised law enforcement officers. These relationships, once shielded by silence, now represented leverage. Frank understood that exposing corruption could shift the balance of power in negotiations. It could also make him valuable. The decision to cooperate was not made lightly. It carried consequences beyond legal outcomes. In the criminal world, cooperation marked a man permanently. Trust evaporated. Reputation shattered. Frank understood that even if he secured his freedom, he would never reclaim his former standing. He accepted this. Power, he knew, was already gone. When he finally agreed to speak, he did so methodically. There were no emotional confessions, no dramatic revelations. He provided information as he had conducted business, clearly, efficiently, and with purpose. Names were given. Structures explained. Corrupt officers identified. Entire networks that had operated quietly were suddenly exposed. For prosecutors, the value of his cooperation was immense. It validated years of suspicion and uncovered layers of corruption that had undermined public trust. Officers who had believed themselves untouchable were arrested and charged. The case expanded beyond drugs, revealing a broader system of abuse and compromise. Frank's cooperation shocked many. To some, it was seen as betrayal. To others, as survival. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed him as a criminal attempting to save himself at the expense of others. Others saw him as a man exposing corruption that would have otherwise remained hidden. Frank did not engage with these judgments. They were irrelevant to his objective. The process was exhausting. Hours of interviews. Repeated testimony. Revisiting decisions made years earlier. Frank remained composed throughout, though the toll was evident. Speaking meant reliving the past, acknowledging the full scope of his actions and their consequences. Silence had once insulated him from reflection. Cooperation forced confrontation. Within prison, his decision isolated him further. Former associates distanced themselves. Rumors circulated. Threats were implied. Frank was moved frequently, placed under protection. The man who had once controlled his environment now lived under constant supervision, dependent on the system he had challenged. Yet there was a strange clarity in this phase of his life. The rules were no longer ambiguous. Survival no longer depended on dominance or control. It depended on patience and compliance. Frank adapted as he always had, adjusting to the new structure imposed upon him. As court proceedings continued, the impact of his cooperation became clear. Charges were reduced. Sentences were reconsidered. The possibility of release, once distant, became tangible. This outcome did not bring relief so much as acceptance. Freedom, if it came, would not resemble the life he had known. Frank also faced the personal cost of his decision. Family members, already affected by his arrest, now grappled with the fallout of his cooperation. Relationships strained. Trust eroded. Frank carried this weight silently. He had always believed in protecting family through control. Now, he confronted the reality that his choices had endangered them. Critics argued that his cooperation allowed him to escape full accountability. Supporters countered that exposing corruption served a greater good. Frank did not frame his actions in either way. He viewed them as necessary. The world he had navigated did not reward sentiment. In time, the legal outcomes reflected the complexity of his case. Sentences were adjusted. Time was served. The future, once defined by certainty of imprisonment, reopened into possibility. Frank, now older and removed from power, prepared for a life that would require reinvention. Cooperation marked the final transformation of Frank Lucas. The man who had built an empire through silence now dismantled it through speech. The code he had lived by dissolved under the pressure of survival. What remained was a man confronting the consequences of a lifetime of calculated decisions. This phase did not offer redemption in the traditional sense. It offered resolution. Frank Lucas accepted the trade he had made. In doing so, he ensured that his story would not end in total darkness, but in a complicated, uneasy light, one that revealed both the system he exploited and the one that ultimately reclaimed him. Prison life stripped Frank Lucas of the illusions that power had once provided. The routines were rigid, the days repetitive, and the authority he had wielded for so long was replaced by a system that recognized no past influence. Inside these walls, status was defined not by wealth or connections, but by compliance and time. Frank entered this world as a man accustomed to control, and adapting to its absence required a different kind of discipline. The first months were the hardest. The sudden loss of autonomy, the constant noise, the lack of privacy, all of it tested his composure. Frank had always managed his environment, shaping outcomes through planning and restraint. In prison, the environment managed him. Lights turned on and off without his say. Meals arrived on schedule regardless of appetite. Movement was regulated. Control was no longer an option. Yet Frank adapted the only way he knew how, by observing. He studied the rhythms of prison life as carefully as he had once studied Harlem streets. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent. He understood quickly that survival depended not on dominance, but on restraint. Drawing attention invited conflict. Remaining unobtrusive offered protection. His cooperation with authorities complicated his position. Word spread, as it always does, and the label followed him. Trust was scarce. Conversations were guarded. Frank did not seek alliances. He accepted isolation as part of the cost of his choices. In this environment, solitude was safer than familiarity. Time moved differently in prison. Days stretched, marked by routine rather than purpose. For a man who had thrived on momentum, this stillness was disorienting. Yet it also created space for reflection. Without the constant demands of his operation, Frank confronted memories he had long kept at bay. He thought often of his childhood in the South, of the violence he had witnessed and the lessons it had taught him. Those early experiences had shaped his belief that power was protection. In prison, that belief was tested. Power no longer insulated him, mistakes were not tolerated simply because of blood ties. This structure created a sense of internal cohesion. Decisions moved quickly. Instructions were understood without lengthy explanations. Disputes were resolved privately. To outsiders, the organization appeared loosely connected, but at its core was a tightly bound unit that answered to Frank alone. Frank's leadership within his family was firm, sometimes severe. He did not allow personal relationships to interfere with business decisions. This emotional distance was deliberate. He believed that blurred boundaries weakened control. By maintaining authority even at home, he reinforced the idea that the operation came first. At the same time, this approach planted seeds of tension. Family members lived under constant pressure to perform and remain silent. The rewards were substantial, but so were the risks. Wealth brought temptation. Power bred ego. Frank understood this and watched closely for signs of drift. To manage these dynamics, he emphasized routine and structure. Roles were clearly defined. Communication followed established channels. No one acted independently. This rigidity reduced chaos, but it also created strain. Some family members chafed under the restrictions, longing for recognition or freedom. Frank saw these desires as threats, not aspirations. Beyond family, Frank maintained a limited inner circle of trusted associates. These were individuals who had proven themselves over time, demonstrating discipline and discretion. Even so, they were kept at arm's length from the operations core. Frank compartmentalized information carefully. No one knew everything. This fragmentation ensured that a single betrayal could not dismantle the entire system. Paranoia, while dangerous, served a purpose. Frank did not trust easily, and he believed that trust should never be unconditional. He monitored behavior, watched for changes in routine, and listened for inconsistencies. This vigilance kept his organization intact, but it also isolated him. True companionship was rare. Conversations were guarded. Relaxation was limited. At home, this tension manifested subtly. Frank's relationships were shaped by control rather than intimacy. He provided materially, but emotionally he remained distant. Family gatherings were calm, almost formal. Laughter existed, but it was measured. Everyone understood the boundaries, even if they were never spoken aloud. The presence of family within the operation also heightened the stakes. Law enforcement pressure did not threaten just Frank, but those he cared about. This added a layer of anxiety that he carried silently. Protecting the system now meant protecting his bloodline. Failure would not only cost freedom, but legacy. Frank justified this risk through belief in discipline. He believed that if everyone followed the rules, the system would endure. He reminded his family often that attention was dangerous. Flashy behavior, careless talk, or public disputes were forbidden. Those who violated these rules faced swift consequences, regardless of relation. This environment bred compliance, but not necessarily peace. Some family members struggled under the weight of expectation. They were wealthy but constrained, powerful but monitored. Frank recognized this tension but did not soften his approach. From his perspective, comfort bred carelessness. Outside the family, rumors circulated about Frank's control. Some admired it, seeing a man who had built something unbreakable. Others feared it, interpreting his quiet authority as coldness. Frank did not concern himself with these opinions. Reputation, he believed, was secondary to function. As the operation continued to expand, the complexity of managing loyalty increased. More money meant more temptation. More exposure meant more risk. Frank responded by tightening control rather than loosening it. He centralized decision-making, limited access, and reinforced discipline. This concentration of power, while effective, also created vulnerability. It had, in many ways, led him here. Frank also reflected on the people affected by his actions. The faces of those harmed by addiction, once abstract, became harder to ignore in stillness. He did not indulge in self-pity or overt remorse. His reflections were quiet, analytical. He acknowledged consequences without dramatizing them. Daily routines became a form of structure he could accept. Exercise, reading, and limited social interaction filled the hours. Frank found solace in routine, recognizing its stabilizing effect. It reminded him that order could exist even in confinement. As years passed, the intensity of prison life softened slightly. Frank aged. The world outside changed. News filtered in slowly, political shifts, cultural changes, a city he barely recognized. Harlem, once the center of his world, transformed beyond his control or influence. This realization carried a strange mix of loss and relief. Relationships within prison remained minimal. Frank avoided conflict and did not involve himself in disputes. His demeanor, calm, respectful, detached, earned him a measure of quiet respect. He was not feared, nor was he admired. He existed on the margins, much as he had during his rise, but without the power that had once accompanied that position. Letters from family were rare and cautious. Distance, both physical and emotional, defined these connections. Frank accepted this. He had chosen survival over loyalty, and the consequences were permanent. There were no expectations of reconciliation, only acknowledgement of reality. The passage of time brought changes to his legal situation. Sentences were revisited. Appeals considered. Hope flickered occasionally, but Frank did not allow himself to dwell on it. He had learned that expectations could be dangerous. Acceptance offered stability. Prison forced Frank to confront the limits of his philosophy. Discipline and silence had served him well, but they could not prevent decline. Control had been an illusion, temporary and conditional. This realization did not embitter him. It clarified his understanding of power's true nature. In quieter moments, Frank considered what life beyond prison might look like. He knew it would not resemble the past. There would be no empire to rebuild, no system to control. Any future would be smaller, quieter, and constrained by history. He accepted this as the final evolution of his journey. Prison did not redeem Frank Lucas, nor did it destroy him entirely. It reduced him. It removed layers of identity until what remained was a man shaped by experience, stripped of pretense. In that reduction, there was a kind of honesty he had never known before. As the years continued, Frank lived with the understanding that his story had already been written. What remained was endurance. Not the endurance of ambition, but of time. And in that endurance, he found a measure of peace, not from absolution, but from acceptance. When Frank Lucas finally stepped beyond the prison gates, the world he returned to felt unfamiliar, as though time had moved forward without waiting for him. The air outside was the same, yet everything else had shifted. Years of confinement had separated him from the rhythm of daily life, and now that rhythm felt faster, louder, and less forgiving. Freedom, once the ultimate prize, arrived quietly, carrying with it uncertainty rather than relief. Harlem, the place that had once defined him, was no longer the Harlem he remembered. Streets he had walked with confidence now felt altered, reshaped by gentrification, new businesses, and unfamiliar faces. Some buildings were gone, replaced by developments that spoke of a different era. Others remained, but their purpose had changed. The neighborhood's energy felt subdued, less raw, less dangerous. The underworld that had once operated in shadows had either evolved or disappeared entirely. Frank moved through these streets as a stranger. There was no entourage, no recognition, no whispered acknowledgments of power. To most, he was simply an older man navigating a city that no longer knew his name. This anonymity, once his greatest strength, now underscored his irrelevance. Re-entering society required adjustments that went beyond geography. Technology had advanced. Communication moved faster. The world operated on systems Frank had never needed to understand. Simple tasks required explanation. He learned patiently, applying the same observational skills that had once served him so well. Relationships were cautious. Family members, long distanced by incarceration and difficult choices, approached him carefully. There were moments of connection, but also unspoken tension. Time had created gaps that could not be easily bridged. Frank did not demand reconciliation. He accepted what was offered, understanding that trust, once broken, rarely returns fully. Financially, his situation was modest. The wealth he had accumulated was gone, seized or spent long ago. This loss did not trouble him as much as one might expect. Money, he had learned, was temporary. Its absence simplified life. Without it, there were fewer expectations, fewer temptations. Frank attempted to live quietly. He avoided attention, just as he always had. This time, however, the quiet was not strategic. It was natural. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to hide. He was simply a man living out the remainder of his years. Occasionally, he encountered people who recognized him, usually through stories or documentaries that had emerged during his absence. Their reactions varied: curiosity, judgment, fascination. Frank did not engage deeply. He understood that his story had taken on a life of its own, shaped by perspectives beyond his control. The contrast between his past and present was stark. Once, decisions he made affected entire neighborhoods. Now, his days were defined by routine and simplicity. Morning walks, quiet meals, occasional conversations. This reduction was not humiliating. It was grounding. Frank reflected often on the choices that had brought him here. He did not romanticize his rise or dwell excessively on his fall. Both felt distant, almost abstract. What mattered now was the present moment and the limited future ahead. Harlem itself continued to evolve. New generations walked streets unaware of the history beneath their feet. The corners that once defined power now hosted coffee shops or stood empty. Frank observed these changes with a detached acceptance. Cities, like people, moved on. In this new phase of life, Frank found a kind of peace that had eluded him during his years of power. There was no constant vigilance, no fear of betrayal, no calculations of risk. The quiet was real, not manufactured. It allowed space for reflection without urgency. He remained aware of the harm his actions had caused. Addiction, suffering, loss, these realities did not vanish with time. Frank did not seek forgiveness publicly or privately. He believed that some consequences could not be undone or absolved. Acknowledgement, he felt, was the most he could offer. As he aged, his physical presence diminished, but his awareness sharpened. He understood that his story was now part of history, not influence. The man who once operated invisibly now existed in plain sight, unnoticed because he no longer mattered in the way he once had. Freedom, he realized, was not the absence of bars. It was the absence of ambition. Without the drive to control, to dominate, to expand, life became simpler. Smaller. Manageable. Frank Lucas had returned to a Harlem that no longer needed him, and in that realization, he found clarity. The city had survived without him. The world had continued. His role, once central, had concluded. What remained was time, limited, quiet, and unburdened by power. And for the first time since childhood, Frank lived within it without expectation. As the years passed and the immediacy of Frank Lucas's power faded into memory, his name began to exist more in stories than in reality. Books, interviews, and eventually films attempted to capture the essence of who he was and what he represented. In this transformation, fact and fiction intertwined, creating a version of Frank Lucas that was at once familiar and distorted. Separating the man from the myth became increasingly difficult, yet increasingly important. Public fascination often gravitates toward extremes. Frank's story offered all the elements people found compelling: a rise from poverty, a challenge to established power, global intrigue, and a quiet, enigmatic personality. These elements were amplified and reshaped to fit narratives that demanded heroes and villains, clarity and drama. In doing so, nuance was often lost. One of the most persistent myths centered on the scale and exclusivity of Frank's operation. While he did succeed in bypassing traditional supply chains and sourcing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, accounts frequently exaggerated the extent of his control. He was not the sole architect of the heroin trade in New York, nor did he operate without competition. His success existed within a broader ecosystem of criminal networks, each adapting and responding to changing conditions. Another area where myth overshadowed reality involved the methods of transportation. The story of heroin being smuggled exclusively in the coffins of fallen American soldiers captured public imagination and moral outrage. While there is evidence that military transport systems were exploited during the Vietnam War, historians continue to debate the specifics. The truth likely involves a range of methods, not a single, cinematic tactic. The coffin narrative, powerful as it is, simplifies a complex and troubling reality. Frank himself contributed to this myth-making, sometimes intentionally, sometimes inadvertently. In interviews later in life, he spoke with a mixture of candor and performance. Memory is imperfect, and storytelling often reshapes events to fit a personal narrative. Frank understood the power of story, even as he once relied on silence. His accounts, while valuable, must be weighed against documented evidence. The film adaptations of his life further blurred the line between truth and entertainment. To create a compelling story, filmmakers emphasized certain traits and events while minimizing others. Frank became a symbol, a quiet rebel, an anti-hero challenging an unjust system. This portrayal resonated with audiences but risked obscuring the harm caused by his actions. The reality was more complicated. Frank Lucas was neither a folk hero nor a singular villain. He was a product of his environment, shaped by systemic racism, economic exclusion, and personal trauma. These factors influenced his choices but did not excuse them. His actions contributed to widespread addiction and suffering, consequences that myth often glosses over. Law enforcement narratives also played a role in shaping his legacy. Some accounts framed his capture as a triumph of justice, while others emphasized corruption exposed through his cooperation. Both perspectives held truth. His case revealed vulnerabilities in the system, including racial bias and institutional corruption, even as it demonstrated the destructive reach of organized crime. Within Harlem, memories of Frank varied. Some remembered him as a quiet presence, others as a distant figure whose actions affected lives indirectly but profoundly. There was no single consensus. Like the neighborhood itself, his legacy was layered and contested. The passage of time softened edges and sharpened contrasts. As newer crises emerged, Frank's story became a historical case study rather than a living concern. This distance allowed for reflection but also invited simplification. Complex truths are harder to remember than compelling myths. Understanding the reality of Frank Lucas requires resisting the urge to glamorize or demonize. It requires acknowledging both his strategic brilliance and the devastation that followed. It means recognizing the broader systems that enabled his rise: war, inequality, corruption, without reducing him to a passive product of circumstance. Frank's story also serves as a lens through which to examine how society remembers crime. Narratives often focus on individual figures, ignoring the structural conditions that allow such figures to emerge. By concentrating on Frank alone, we risk overlooking the broader failures that made his operation possible. In separating myth from reality, one finds a quieter story than popular culture suggests. It is a story of patience rather than spectacle, of systems rather than scenes, of consequences rather than triumphs. This quieter truth aligns more closely with who Frank Lucas actually was, a man who believed in operating beneath the surface, even as his story later rose above it. As audiences continue to engage with his legacy, the challenge lies in holding multiple truths at once. To recognize his ingenuity without admiration. To acknowledge his hardships without justification. To remember the victims without erasing context. In the end, the myth of Frank Lucas may endure longer than the man himself. But the reality, complex and uncomfortable, offers deeper insight, not just into one individual, but into the world that shaped him and the systems that allowed him to rise. In the final years of his life, Frank Lucas moved through the world quietly, almost invisibly, much as he had during the height of his power. Age had slowed him, softening the sharp edges that once defined his presence. The urgency that had driven his rise was gone, replaced by a calm acceptance of time's steady advance. He no longer sought control, nor did he resist the passage of days. Life had narrowed to essentials, and in that narrowing, there was a strange clarity. Frank lived simply. The routines of his days were modest and predictable: short walks, familiar faces, long stretches of silence. There were no secret meetings, no calculations of risk, no networks to manage. The absence of responsibility, once unimaginable, became a form of relief. He had spent decades anticipating threats, measuring loyalty, and managing outcomes. Now, the world asked little of him. Physically, he felt the weight of years. His body carried the marks of time and confinement, reminders of a life lived under constant strain. Yet his mind remained alert. He observed the world around him with the same quiet attentiveness that had once served him so well. The difference was intent. Where he had once watched to gain advantage, he now watched to understand. Harlem, when he visited or passed through, felt like a place from a dream. Familiar streets existed alongside unfamiliar storefronts. The energy was different, less desperate, less raw. New generations moved through spaces once defined by fear and survival, unaware of the histories beneath their feet. Frank did not resent this. He accepted it as proof that eras end, and with them, the people who defined them. Occasionally, journalists or curious strangers sought him out, hoping to capture a final word, a reflection, a confession. Frank was selective. He spoke when he felt it mattered and remained silent when it did not. He understood that his words, once released, would be shaped by others' needs. He no longer felt compelled to correct every misconception. When he did speak, his tone was measured. There was no bravado, no attempt to reclaim stature. He spoke of his life as something completed, not ongoing. The rise, the fall, the prison years, all were chapters already written. He did not dwell on regrets in public, nor did he seek sympathy. He acknowledged consequences without embellishment. Privately, reflection came more easily. Quiet moments invited memory, and memory invited reckoning. Frank thought of the people who had passed through his life, family members, associates, strangers affected by his decisions. He did not attempt to rewrite the past. He accepted it in full, understanding that acceptance was not absolution, but it was honest. There was a humility in this final phase that had not existed before. Power had once shaped his identity. Without it, he was forced to confront who he was beneath ambition and control. The answer was neither flattering nor damning. He was simply human, shaped by circumstance, choice, and consequence. As his health declined, Frank became more introspective. Time felt finite in a way it never had before. The less people knew, the safer the operation remained. Managing this transnational supply chain required discipline and trust. Frank avoided unnecessary communication, limiting knowledge to those who absolutely needed it. He understood that information was a liability. The fewer people involved, the fewer points of failure. This approach mirrored his overall philosophy: reduce exposure, increase control. The risks, however, were immense. International trafficking invited scrutiny from multiple agencies. A single intercepted shipment could unravel everything. Frank accepted this risk with the same calm resolve that had defined his life. He believed that careful planning and disciplined execution could mitigate danger, though never eliminate it. As shipments began to arrive, the impact was immediate. Harlem's heroin supply changed. The product was purer, more consistent, and cheaper than what competitors could offer. Dealers noticed. Users noticed. Demand surged. Frank had achieved what few thought possible: he had disrupted an entrenched system by operating beyond its reach. This success did not make him reckless. On the contrary, it reinforced his commitment to discretion. He resisted the temptation to expand too quickly or draw attention to his role. Others took credit. Others absorbed risk. Frank remained in the background, ensuring that the machinery continued to function. The connection between war and drugs is an uncomfortable one. It reveals how conflict creates spaces where morality erodes and exploitation thrives. Frank Lucas's operation was a product of this environment. It was enabled by systemic failures and human desperation. Understanding this context does not excuse the harm caused, but it does explain how such an operation could exist. As the flow of heroin from Southeast Asia to New York stabilized, Frank's position strengthened. He had achieved independence from the mafia supply chain, altering the balance of power in Harlem. This shift would have profound consequences, both for those who benefited from it and for those who suffered its effects. He did not fear death, but he respected it. It represented the final loss of control, something he had resisted his entire life. Now, he met it with quiet resignation. Those closest to him in these final years described him as calm, reflective, and reserved. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no public apologies, no grand statements. Frank believed that some things were better left unspoken. Words could not undo harm, nor could they fully explain a life lived in shadows. When he passed away, the news arrived without fanfare. There were no large crowds, no public mourning, no dramatic headlines. For some, his death marked the end of a notorious chapter. For others, it barely registered at all. The world, as it always does, continued. In death, as in life, Frank Lucas remained a figure defined by quiet. There was no spectacle, no final gesture to reclaim attention. Just the closing of a long, complicated story. His passing invited reflection, not celebration. It reminded those who remembered him that power is fleeting, that control is temporary, and that every rise carries an ending. Frank Lucas had once believed he could manage every outcome. In the end, he accepted that some outcomes cannot be managed at all. The era he represented, one shaped by segregation, war, and underground economies, had already faded. New challenges had taken its place. Frank's story became part of history, a reference point rather than a living force. What remained after his death was not an empire, but a lesson. Not a moral lesson easily summarized, but a human one. A life defined by discipline and silence, by ambition and consequence, by control and its inevitable loss. Frank Lucas did not leave behind a legacy he could shape or protect. He left behind a story others would interpret. In that sense, his final surrender of control was complete. The quiet king had reached his end, not with noise or resistance, but with the same subdued presence that had defined his rise. And in that stillness, his story closed, not triumphantly, not tragically, but inevitably. When the story of Frank Lucas finally settles into silence, what remains is not the image of a kingpin or a criminal mastermind, but something quieter and more complex. His life, stripped of myth and spectacle, becomes a meditation on power, how it is gained, how it is maintained, and how inevitably it slips away. Frank's journey does not end with a moral neatly tied in a bow. Instead, it lingers, inviting reflection long after the details fade. Frank Lucas believed deeply in control. From his earliest years in the South, control represented safety. Watching violence unfold without consequence taught him that those without power were vulnerable, disposable. Everything he built later in life can be traced back to that lesson. His empire was not born from chaos or thrill-seeking, but from a calculated desire to never again be helpless. In this sense, his rise was not impulsive, but methodical, almost inevitable. Yet power, once obtained, demanded constant attention. It required silence, discipline, and emotional distance. Frank mastered these tools, but they came at a cost. Relationships became transactional. Trust became conditional. Life narrowed to strategy and vigilance. The very qualities that protected him also isolated him, leaving little room for peace even at the height of his success. There is a temptation to admire the efficiency of his operation, the way he outmaneuvered entrenched systems and redefined an underground economy. But efficiency does not exist in a vacuum. It produces consequences. Frank's control over supply translated into widespread addiction, suffering, and loss. Neighborhoods bore the weight of decisions made quietly, far from the streets where their effects were felt most deeply. His story forces an uncomfortable truth into focus: intelligence and discipline are morally neutral. They can be used to build or to destroy, to protect or to exploit. Frank's brilliance lay in understanding systems, but he applied that understanding to a trade that fed on desperation. The harm that followed was not accidental. It was intrinsic. At the same time, reducing Frank Lucas to a single dimension misses the broader context that shaped him. He was not created in isolation. Segregation, limited opportunity, systemic inequality, and the chaos of war all played roles in creating the conditions he exploited. Acknowledging this does not excuse his actions, but it complicates judgment. His life exists at the intersection of personal choice and structural failure. Frank's eventual fall underscores another truth about power: it is never absolute. No matter how carefully constructed, no system remains invisible forever. The same patience and discipline that allowed him to rise were mirrored by those who pursued him. Control met control. Silence met patience. In the end, the system he believed he had mastered proved larger than him. His decision to cooperate with authorities marked a final shift in identity. The man who built an empire on silence dismantled it through speech. Survival replaced loyalty. Pragmatism replaced code. This choice ensured his release, but it also erased any remaining illusions about honor in the world he had inhabited. What remained was consequence, unavoidable and permanent. In his final years, stripped of power and wealth, Frank lived quietly. This quiet was different from the strategic silence of his rise. It was not protective or calculated. It was simply the absence of ambition. In that absence, he encountered a version of life he had never known, one without constant threat, but also without influence. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Frank Lucas's legacy is how little remains of his empire. Money vanished. Networks dissolved. Control evaporated. Harlem moved on. The city absorbed his absence without pause. This impermanence challenges the idea that power leaves lasting monuments. Often, it leaves only memory, and even that fades. What endures instead are questions. What does it mean to survive at all costs? When does adaptation become exploitation? Can discipline justify destruction? Frank's life does not answer these questions. It poses them. For listeners drawn to stories like his, there is often a search for clarity, a hero, a villain, a lesson. Frank Lucas offers none easily. He was neither mythic rebel nor mindless criminal. He was a man shaped by fear, sharpened by intelligence, and undone by the same systems he learned to navigate so well. In the end, his story aligns with a universal pattern. Rise. Control. Decline. Acceptance. It is a pattern repeated across history, in empires and individuals alike. Frank Lucas's life is one variation of that pattern, distinguished not by noise, but by quiet. As the narrative closes, what lingers is not admiration or condemnation, but stillness. The understanding that power, when pursued as protection, often becomes its own prison. That silence, when used as armor, eventually becomes isolation. And that control, no matter how carefully maintained, is always temporary. Frank Lucas once believed that by mastering systems, he could master fate. His life suggests otherwise. Fate waits patiently. It does not announce itself. It does not rush. It arrives when the balance shifts, when silence falters, when control gives way to time. And so the story ends not with judgment, but with reflection. A quiet acknowledgement that beneath every empire lies a human being, and beneath every rise lies the certainty of an ending.